日は英国のデータモニターリミテッド日本支社の方から講師の方をお迎えいたしております。オンコロジー市場の現状と今後の課題ということでタイトルをお設けさせていただいておりますけれども、イアン・ヘイドック様はデータモニターグループにおいて世界の製薬業界の日々のニュースおよび業界分析情報を提供するスクリップインテリジェンス部門のアジア統括エディターでおられます。それではよろしくお願いいたします。
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you also to the British Embassy for inviting me to speak here today. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to do really is just provide a very general overview of some of the major issues affecting the pharmaceutical industry today and how the industry is responding. And I would also like to cover some factors in the oncology market. I thought it would be nice to start off with this cartoon, which, although it looks like a joke, it actually has quite a serious meaning. And that meaning is that to survive in the pharmaceutical industry of today, you need a different set of skills than you needed perhaps a few years ago. The industry has traditionally been reliant on the blockbuster model, which could perhaps be represented by the macho guy on the left there. But what you need to survive in the industry now is a different set of skills represented by the three, let's call them nerds. Now, I tried to make this slide simpler, but it just really wasn't possible. I think the pharmaceutical industry is quite unique in that it has such a complex mix of factors affecting both the performance of companies and the overall healthcare system. What we've tried to do here is really outline some of the major issues affecting the industry. We've seen across the world that healthcare costs are rising, and this is not only in the developed Western markets, but also in the developing markets. Places like China, we're seeing rising incidence of chronic diseases such as diabetes, also in other emerging markets such as India. Meanwhile, the global economy has taken a downturn since the 2008 financial crisis. We've seen some recovery since then, but in general, economic growth remains relatively weak. Within the industry itself, we've seen major impact on the patent cliff, again, which peaked in about the 2012-2013 period, which has led to about $100 billion in lost branded sales from the expiry of patents, mainly in the US. All of these factors are interlinked and are leading to increased cost containment pressures on the industry. In the meantime, regulatory requirements are getting ever more tougher. And so the pharma industry is facing a need to deal with all of these factors, and the challenge has been, for many branded companies, how to respond. And I'll go into detail a bit more later about the three main approaches that the branded industry is taking to respond to these various factors that are all interlinked. As I mentioned, the global economy has been stagnating ever since about 2008, which in Japan, that period was termed the Lehman shock. And although there was recovery after that, in the 2009-2010 period, since then, over the last few years, we've seen fairly low economic growth across both the developed economies and the emerging countries. And you'll see that they parallel each other fairly well in terms of how they perform, given the interlinked nature of the global economy. And looking out a bit further ahead, perhaps to the 2013, 14, 15 period, in major economies such as the UK and Japan, we'll probably see growth maybe in the 2 to 3% range. And this is also happening in the emerging markets as well. And one of the main issues for the industry, I think, this year is going to be slowing growth in major emerging markets such as China. Whereas before we could rely on perhaps 8 or 10% growth in China, there are now many forecasts that that growth will slow to perhaps 6 or 7%. So what does this slowing growth mean in terms of government response to healthcare costs, which I mentioned before, are rising? Well, what we've seen across the board in many countries and in the developed world is increased pressure on drug prices and on reimbursement levels. Those of you from Japan, I notice many of you in the room here today will be very familiar with the Japanese system of price cuts every 2 years. It's designed to control healthcare costs and bring actual drug prices into line with market levels. But even in other countries such as Spain, we've seen drug price cuts affecting both branded and generic products, basically driven by government austerity measures. And all of this is adding to the pressure on the industry and pushing down prices of drugs. Part of the response of the industry has been to adopt differential pricing in some markets. And we've actually seen this by some companies such as GlaxoSmithKline. They're adopting differential prices in some developing markets compared to levels in the West. In fact, some Japanese companies are also adopting differential pricing, perhaps the main example being Eisai, which is present in markets such as India, and they're adopting lower levels for some of their key products in those markets to reflect the pressures in those markets and reflect lower spending capabilities. And part of the other response by the industry has been to try and develop drug portfolios to match the unmet needs in those markets. And again, I'll go into detail a bit later on some of the industry responses to that. So, this graph really shows that in the developed European countries at least, healthcare spending typically ranges between about 15 and 19% of total government expenditure. There isn't really great big variation in that. But what we do see is quite a big variation in spending on drugs as a percentage of total healthcare expenditure. And you may notice that Japan in particular stands out as being very high. We're talking perhaps 22, 23% of healthcare spending is actually spent on drugs in Japan. And perhaps at the end I'd be interested to get your views on why you think that is. Why drug spending in Japan is so high compared to other countries. And of course, because it is high, it also stands out as an easy target for budget cost controls, and which we've seen with the biannual price cuts in Japan. Now, as far as the industry is concerned, it's a pretty good situation, I guess, in Japan compared to other countries. And in fact, major industry associations, such as pharma, would actually like to see an increase in drug spending and spending on overall healthcare as a percentage of GDP in Japan, because they see it as a cost-effective solution to health and controlling overall healthcare costs. As far as the patent cliff is concerned, I think we're probably over the worst. The peak really came in about 2012, when we saw almost $29 billion worth of original drugs come off patent. And we've seen major products such as Lipitor lose their exclusivity in the US. And of course in the US you get very rapid generic erosion, generics entering the market on the first day after the loss of exclusivity. So within the 3 years up to 2012, a total of almost $59 billion worth of drugs came off patent. And so I think we're over the hump as far as the branded industry goes and the loss of those revenues from the patent cliff. Over the 2016 to 2020 period, we're seeing a relatively small 18.3 billion drop in sales from the loss of exclusivity. So, it's a much smaller figure than compared to the 2010 to 2012 period. So, one good factor for the industry is that we seem to be over the worst as far as the patent cliff goes. So what does this all mean for the outlook for the branded pharma industry? What we can say for sure is that exposure to generics and biosimilars, several major products of which are scheduled to go off patent within the next few years, will increase. I think it's safe to say that that will be a factor. What's more uncertain is how the global economy will develop and how that will translate into pressure on the drug sector. And also how governments will actually, what policies they will adopt for containing costs and how regulatory regimes might develop. But I think what is certain overall is that the industry as a whole, the branded industry, will continue to come under pressure on these various factors as we go forward over the next few years. So what is pharma doing to address this situation that I've outlined? There are probably three main categories of response. And the first is innovation. If you can innovate, come up with new drugs, you can guarantee you will have market superiority. If you're first to market with a new class of drugs, say for cancer, you're going to hold a strong position in that sector. You're meeting a high unmet need in the sector. You're improving the technology that's available. But the downside is that this takes time and it involves a lot of risk. You can't innovate overnight. Pipelines take several years to move through, and you need the infrastructure and the technical expertise to be in place to deliver that innovation. But what is for sure is that innovation is central to the success of the pharma industry going forward. What we've also seen over the last few years is a gradual shift away from traditional small molecules, where most of the pharma industry's R&D effort has been focused, more towards monoclonal antibodies and vaccines. And this is reflected in this growth outlook for the biologics sector. We expect to see more growth in the biologics sector going forward over the next few years, perhaps in the 8 to 10% range, compared to fairly static sales for small molecules. So pharma is refocusing its R&D into biologics and away from small molecules, and again we're seeing this particularly in oncology, where you're seeing the emergence of targeted therapies. And also we've seen this for a lot of the Japanese companies. Over the last year or two have been moving into vaccines quite strongly, Takeda being a good example. And we're also seeing other moves by companies such as Daiichi Sankyo into the vaccines field, because they see that as a high growth area. And Takeda in particular is targeting vaccines for diseases in the developing world rather than the developing world. The second major strategy that pharma companies are taking is diversifying. A big part of this has involved moving into emerging markets, away from the traditional Western markets, where growth may be fairly static or slow, and into faster growing emerging markets. And we've seen numerous examples of this. GSK is a good example, and also in Japan, Takeda. The Nycomed acquisition was driven in large part by a desire to move into emerging markets, to get a strong position in areas such as Latin America and Eastern Europe. We're also seeing diversification into generics and biosimilars. Probably the prime example here is Novartis and Sandoz, which is a parallel business developing generics alongside branded products within the same group. And the advantage, of course, is that this mitigates risk. If your business is spread among different areas, you're not reliant on one particular area, and also if you're spread geographically, you can take advantage of higher growth in emerging markets. The downside, of course, is it may dilute the margins, the traditionally high margins that you get from your branded business in Western markets. And of course, moving into new markets also has its own risk in that new products may fail to realise their commercial potential. The other main strand of the diversification strategy is to move into non-prescription products. And here, I guess Roche is the best example. They have a parallel business in, in diagnostics, which they're developing in parallel to the branded pharma business. And they see that as a complementary business to their main drug operations. Particularly with the emergence of targeted oncotherapies, you often need companion diagnostics, which they will develop themselves in parallel. The final strand of approach by branded pharma companies to deal with the changing environment worldwide is cost savings. And again, we've seen many examples of this over the last few years through M&A, major acquisitions. I mentioned Takeda, Micromed. And also, we've also seen moves in Japan and outside Japan to reduce internal R&D and increase collaboration with external partners. And I would pick out Astellas as the prime example within the Japanese industry of a company that has really been very active striking alliances with sometimes quite small external partners, mainly in the US, sometimes in Europe, to develop new compounds in the pipeline, to mitigate risk, and to tap into expertise that they may not have in-house. Now, we've also seen on the part of big pharma and also in the mid-sized companies extensive restructuring over the last few years. We've seen thousands of jobs go in the major pharmaceutical companies in the West, in the Pfizer's of this world, and we've also seen some restructuring by the major Japanese companies as well over the last several years. So overall, against the background of these major changes, this would seem to suggest that the opportunities for external collaboration and outsourcing are increasing across the development timeline, right from discovery research through clinical development to launch and marketing. And this slide really attempts to show the current state of affairs in terms of industry outsourcing. And you can see that the main focus at this stage is really on the preclinical and clinical area, where pharma companies will be working with major CROs and contract research organizations to carry out preclinical and clinical trials. But in the earlier stages of research, in terms of drug discovery, while some work is going on, I would think there's a lot of room to actually increase the activities in this area. And it's been interesting over the last year or two to see companies in China in particular making moves to reach alliances with companies in the West for discovery, research and discovery technology, which they don't have in-house. As this meeting is focusing on oncology, the next set of slides is really just a snapshot of where the current oncology market is. And these data come from Data Monitor, our in-house databases. And I hope we'll just give some idea of where the oncology sector is going. In general, we expect to see good growth over the next few years. 2013, the total oncology market was valued at about $67 billion worldwide. We foresee that increasing perhaps to around $81 billion by the 2018 period, with growth by the end of that period of about 6%. And we expect to see growth across the major markets of the US, Japan, and the EU. And not surprisingly, the US will remain the major market for the oncology sector over the next few years. This is really just a snapshot of the top oncology companies in the sector. What comes out of this is really that the Swiss companies dominate. Roche is the top company in terms of approved products, about 20 on the market for various forms of cancer. When you look at the pipeline, what's being developed, Novartis comes out top with about 93 projects. And the bar on the top right really shows which areas of focus the companies are looking at. Not surprisingly, the main indications of solid tumours, breast cancer, non-small cell lung cancer come out as top. And it's interesting to see also the number of failures in the sector. And in particular, colorectal cancer stands out as a difficult target. We have a relatively small number of approved products or products in the pipeline compared to the number of failures. And again, it would be interesting to get feedback from the audience as to why that is a particularly difficult indication. The bottom graph also shows why oncology is such a difficult area to work in. We've had almost 1,500 suspended projects for various reasons, either clinical efficacy or safety. But in phase 2, we've got close to 900 projects currently in development. And that suggests that in the next few years, you're going to see a good stream of products coming through onto the market, assuming approval. This is just a snapshot of one particular product, Herceptin, which again shows a typical life cycle for a product which I mentioned earlier, the sales increasing to a peak, and then gradually tailing off as the patent expiries come in. In 2012, Herceptin generated worldwide sales of about $6.3 billion. But that is expected to tail off by the 2018 period to about $4.3 billion as major patent expiries come through and generic competition increases. So it's basically a pretty typical life cycle you will see for a branded product. And again, Japan stands out here as being a fairly low sales market for Herceptin. And again, I would be interested to receive people's views on that and what are the reasons for that. Finally, this is just some data from another database that we have in-house called Biomed Tracker. Again, it's showing the top companies by number of projects in development and type of projects in development. Although small molecules are still dominating the oncology area in terms of pipeline work, as I mentioned before, we're seeing monoclonal antibodies come through with about 340 projects now moving through development. And the list on the right is really just a snapshot of some of the major projects in development at the moment. So all of this data can be sliced and diced different ways and will enable you to have a look at the market and what's in development. Now, given this is a joint UK-Japan symposium, I thought it would be interesting to take just a quick look at the history of the two countries and how they compare in terms of drug development. This is really just a snapshot. I think we've seen in the UK a very strong history of drug development since the 60s, when the H2 antagonists first came out from research carried out in the UK, by the then Glaxo. While in Japan, the statins came out of research at Sankyo in the 70s and 80s. And the thing that struck me in looking at both countries was that although they are relatively small, they punch above their weight in pharma R&D. In fact, the UK has the highest R&D spend in Europe at about 5.6 billion euros, which is, if my calculations are correct, is about 4.6 billion pounds. And that was the 2011 figure, and it's based on members of EFPIA, the European Federation. Japan, meanwhile, spent about 7.3 billion pounds across the industry on R&D. I think you would agree that both of these are relatively high figures that show a very active R&D activities in both countries. And of course, all this work has resulted in new products moving through. In the whole of Europe, not just in the UK, we've seen about 55 new chemical entities and new biological entities emerge over the 2008 to 12 period. Whilst in Japan, we've seen 26 new drugs in both of those categories come out of corporate research over that time scale. So I think you would agree that both countries are productive. Finally, I'd just like to touch on some of the benefits of the Japanese companies that may be thinking of either locating in the UK or working with UK companies, what potential benefits might be. I think it's true to say that the UK has a very strong research culture, both in the public sector and in the private sector, as I mentioned previously. And I think also the business culture is relatively similar. They're both island countries, maybe both slightly reserved in their way of doing business. I think actually it's a good match between the two. Language, although England doesn't speak Japanese, they do speak English. And I think in terms of Japanese companies locating to the UK, that's a relatively easy language to deal with. And it would also give you good access to the EU from a UK base. And also within the UK, there is a large number of regional, national and local schemes to support R&D, to support investment. And this is something that I'm sure the Embassy will be able to provide more details of. And particularly exciting over the next few years will be the emergence of new bioclusters. And the one in Cambridge in particular, I think deserves a mention. AstraZeneca is going to relocate there fairly shortly. And we're also seeing alongside that site, the new Papworth Hospital is going to be located within the next few years. So I think the Cambridge campus is really emerging as a major node of public and private research in the UK and provides a lot of opportunities for collaboration between the two sectors. And just a very quick overview of some of the major policy issues in Japan for those UK companies perhaps thinking of partnering with companies in Japan, looking at moving into the Japanese market. I would say, as long as I've been here, pricing and price cuts has been by far the dominant policy issue. And this April, we're going to see some changes to the pricing system in terms of changes to the system of premiums that are given to new drugs. And one of the ideas of the changes is to support the development of new drugs in Japan. There will be a new premium for drugs that are developed for the first time in Japan. So I think the government is quite conscious of trying to provide some sort of incentive for carrying out R&D in Japan. And we've also seen, since the Abe government came into power last year, a number of new support programs for R&D in the life sciences sector. And in particular, the proposal for a new National Institute of Health along the lines of that in the US is a major proposal that's been garnering a lot of attention. I think if it comes to fruition, it will be a major plus point for the support of academic and industry research and the coordination of that research. It may not be so relevant for the companies here today, but the Japanese government has also been supporting the development of generics through various policy changes we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years, changes to prescription forms, new fees and so on to encourage the development of the generics sector. And possibly this year we're also going to see the Trans-Pacific Partnership signed, which again could bring major changes across the region and in Japan to policy connected to intellectual property in particular, and biologics development in terms of exclusivity periods and so on. But because the talks are so secretive, it's actually very difficult to know what's going on, so hopefully it should become clearer this year. And finally, another positive policy development has been the adoption by the Japanese government of new policies for the reimbursement of vaccines. Again, we've seen changes here over the last few years, which has meant products such as HPV vaccines being included on the reimbursement tariff. So overall, I would say that there have been a lot of positive developments over the last couple of years on the Japanese policy front. So to finish off, I'd just like to wish all companies taking part today have fruitful discussions and have managed to sign some deals and reach some agreements with your Japanese or English partners. Thank you very much.